When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, the men who had run it were either dead, on trial, or in hiding. But their wives, the women who had shared their beds, their homes, and in many cases their secrets, quietly slipped into the aftermath. Some were arrested, some disappeared, some lived out long, comfortable lives in plain sight. And almost none of them ever faced a courtroom. Coming up, the fates of the women closest to the men who built the Nazi regime, starting with the one whose story almost nobody talks about. Of all the stories that emerged from the final days of the Third Reich, Magda Goebbels remains among the most disturbing. Not because of what was done to her, but because of what she chose to do. Magda was the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda and one of Adolf Hitler's most devoted inner circle members. She was not a passive figure standing in the background. She was known throughout Nazi Germany as the First Lady of the Reich, a title that carried real meaning, given that Hitler never married publicly and had no official consort. Magda appeared at state functions, gave interviews about German womanhood, and was held up by the regime's propaganda apparatus as a model of the ideal National Socialist wife and mother. She had 6 children with Joseph, all of whose names began with the letter H, a naming tradition that began with Magda's first marriage and that some writers have attributed to admiration for Hitler, though historians have found no firm evidence for that interpretation. By April 1945, the Soviet army was closing in on Berlin from multiple directions. The city was being shelled around the clock. Hitler retreated to his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, and the Goebbels family followed him there. Joseph and Magda could have fled. Many senior Nazis were doing exactly that, making their way south toward Austria or west toward Allied lines, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Routes were still open. Magda's son from her first marriage, Harold Quandt, was a Luftwaffe officer who survived the war and went on to become one of West Germany's wealthiest industrialists. He had urged his mother to leave. She refused. On May 1st, 1945, the day after Hitler had taken his own life in the bunker, Magda administered a sedative to each of her 6 children, who ranged in age from 4 to 12 years old. Once they were unconscious, a cyanide compound was placed in the mouth of each child. All 6 died. Their names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. Afterward, Magda and Joseph Goebbels went up to the Reich Chancellery garden, where both died. Accounts vary on the precise sequence, but both took cyanide and their bodies were set alight, though the fire did not fully consume them. Soviet forces found their remains the following day. What made Magda's choice so deeply troubling to historians and psychologists who have studied the case in the decades since is the deliberateness of it. She left a letter for Harold, her surviving son, written days before her death, in which she explained that she could not imagine a world without National Socialism for her children to grow up in. She framed what she did as an act of motherly protection. The children, she wrote, were too good and too beautiful for the world that was coming. It was a rationale that demonstrated how completely the ideology had consumed her sense of reality. She was not a woman broken by war and acting in desperation. She was a true believer, making what she considered a coherent choice. And that is precisely what makes her case so difficult to set aside. Among all the stories of the women connected to the Nazi leadership, hers is the one that most directly confronts the question of how an ordinary human being arrives at an act that the rest of the world finds incomprehensible. Magda Goebbels chose to die alongside the Reich, but most of the other wives made a very different calculation. And what happened to them once the war ended raises uncomfortable questions about how justice was applied and to whom. Emmy Goering was, in many respects, the most publicly visible wife in the Nazi hierarchy during the war years. Her husband, Hermann Goering, was the founder of the Gestapo, commander of the Luftwaffe, and for most of the 1930s, the second most powerful man in Germany after Hitler himself. Emmy had been a successful stage actress before their marriage in 1935, and she took to the role of senior Nazi consort with a flair that matched her theatrical background. Their home, a vast estate called Karen Hall north of Berlin, named after Goering's first wife, who had died in 1931, became a showcase of looted art from across occupied Europe. Emmy presided over lavish receptions there, entertaining foreign dignitaries, artists, and officers in surroundings that reflected the extraordinary wealth her husband had accumulated through the systematic plundering of conquered territories and Jewish-owned properties. She wore jewelry that had been confiscated from Jewish families. She lived in rooms decorated with paintings stolen from French and Dutch museums. Goering had established a special unit tasked with identifying and seizing artworks from across occupied Europe, a looting operation of staggering scale that sent thousands of individual works to his private collection. Emmy was the mistress of a household that was, in its physical construction, a monument to theft, and by all available accounts, she asked no questions about where any of it came from. When the war ended, Emmy was arrested by American forces. Her husband, Hermann Goering, was among the senior Nazi defendants at the Nuremberg trials. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentenced to death, and, on the night before his scheduled execution in October 1946, died after ingesting a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled to him. How it reached him was never conclusively established, though various theories have involved a sympathetic American guard, and at least one account suggesting it had been concealed in a container of skin lotion. Emmy herself was tried by a German denazification court, not by the Nuremberg Tribunal, and in 1948 was classified as an activist in service of the Nazi regime. She was sentenced to 1 year of forced labor and had her assets confiscated. In practice, however, the sentence was reduced and she served a relatively short period. She was released and within a few years had recovered a portion of her confiscated property through legal appeals. She spent the rest of her life in Munich, where she lived quietly and wrote a memoir published in 1967, in which she described her marriage in affectionate terms and presented herself primarily as a wife and mother, rather than a participant in the regime. She made no substantial acknowledgement of the origins of the wealth she had enjoyed, and expressed sorrow for her husband's death at Nuremberg, while stopping well short of condemning his actions. Emmy Goering died in 1973 at the age of 80. Her daughter, Edda Goering, named after the daughter of Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, spent decades pursuing legal claims for the return of artworks and property seized after the war. Many of those claims were unsuccessful, but the persistence with which they were pursued attracted periodic attention in Germany as a reminder of how much unresolved material business the post-war period had left behind. Emmy Goering spent her final decades in quiet comfort, but some wives faced a far harsher reckoning, particularly those whose husbands had been directly responsible for the machinery of mass killing. One of those women was Hedwig Himmler, and her post-war life is one of the most quietly scandalous chapters of the entire era. Heinrich Himmler was the head of the SS and the Gestapo, and the man most directly responsible for the organization and execution of the Holocaust. More than any other individual in the Nazi hierarchy, Himmler built and ran the system of concentration and extermination camps that killed millions of people. When historians refer to the administrative machinery of genocide, the organization Himmler controlled is what they are describing. His wife, Hedwig, known as Marga, had married him in 1928, years before he rose to the heights of power. She was 7 years older than Heinrich, a former nurse who had saved enough money to buy a small chicken farm that the couple ran in the early years of their marriage, before the SS salary made such ventures unnecessary. They had one daughter together, Gudrun, born in 1929. By the time Heinrich Himmler was overseeing the construction of death camps in occupied Poland, Marga was living on a comfortable estate and managing the domestic side of a marriage that had, by the early 1940s, become largely formal. Heinrich had established a long-term relationship with his secretary, Hedwig Pothast, with whom he had 2 children. Marga was aware of this arrangement. She did not leave. In the final weeks of the war, Himmler made a series of increasingly desperate moves. He attempted, without Hitler's authorization, to open secret surrender negotiations with the Western Allies through intermediaries connected to the Swedish Red Cross. When Hitler learned of this, he stripped Himmler of all his positions and ordered his arrest. Himmler fled, disguising himself as a regular soldier. He was captured by British forces in May 1945 and died shortly after. He bit down on a concealed cyanide capsule during a medical examination before he could be properly interrogated. Marga Himmler was arrested and held in various Allied internment camps until 1946. A denazification court subsequently classified her as a fellow traveler, a relatively lenient designation, and she was released. She went on to live in West Germany, where she died in 1967. But the more significant post-war story belongs to her daughter, Gudrun. Gudrun Himmler grew up to become one of the most dedicated and active defenders of former SS members in post-war West Germany. Under her married name, Gudrun Burwitz, she was a central figure in an organization called Stille Hilfe, which translates to Silent Help, a network that provided legal assistance, financial support, and safe passage to convicted war criminals and former SS officers who were sought by justice systems across Europe and beyond. The network had connections to sympathetic figures within the Catholic Church and operated for decades largely out of public view. Gudrun Burwitz never recanted her admiration for her father. In interviews given over the decades, she consistently described Heinrich Himmler in warm, personal terms and declined to engage with the historical record of his actions. Stille Hilfe, the organization she helped lead, was not a fringe operation. It had connections to sympathetic figures within the Catholic Church, to veterans associations, and to individuals within West German political circles who preferred that certain histories remain undisturbed. The network assisted in securing legal representation for convicted war criminals, helped families of imprisoned SS men with financial support, and in some documented cases, facilitated the movement of wanted individuals to avoid extradition. Among those Stille Hilfe reportedly assisted was Klaas Karl Faber, a Dutch SS member convicted of multiple killings who had fled to West Germany and successfully resisted Dutch extradition attempts for decades. Gudrun Burwitz died in 2018 at the age of 88, and her death was reported with a mixture of relief and grim reflection by historians and survivors' organizations across Europe. The Himmler family's post-war activities show how networks of support for former Nazis operated quietly for decades. But nowhere was that more visible than in the story of the wife of the man who ran Auschwitz. Because she did not just survive, she went back. Rudolf Höss was the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, the largest and most lethal of the Nazi extermination complexes. Under his command, more than 1 million people, the vast majority of them Jewish, were killed. He was a meticulous administrator who kept records, made logistical improvements to increase the camp's capacity, and took a professional pride in what he described as the efficiency of the operation. He was captured by British forces in 1946, tried before a Polish court, and hanged at Auschwitz in April 1947, on the grounds of the camp he had commanded. His wife, Hedwig Höss, had lived with their 5 children in a large, comfortable house located directly adjacent to the camp perimeter. From the garden of that house, it was possible to see the rooftops of the camp buildings. The smell from the crematoria reached their home. Hedwig Höss was not stationed at a distance from what her husband did. She was next door to it for years. She described her time at Auschwitz as the happiest years of her life. That statement comes from her own account, given after the war, and it was not an isolated remark. It was a considered reflection on a period she associated with domestic comfort, a pleasant garden, and a well-run household. What was happening on the other side of the fence did not, by her own account, intrude on that contentment. After Rudolf's arrest, Hedwig and the children were interned briefly and then released into the general population of post-war Germany. She was never charged with any crime. No court examined her knowledge of what had taken place at Auschwitz or her role in the domestic economy of the camp, which had relied on Jewish prisoner labor for household tasks. Prisoners who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the Höss family home while their fellow inmates were being killed meters away. That arrangement was not a secret. It was a standard feature of how senior camp staff lived, and Hedwig Höss was one of its principal beneficiaries. The Polish prosecutor's office, which handled Rudolf Höss's trial, did not pursue Hedwig as a separate defendant. The denazification process in the Allied-occupied zones of Germany was not designed to reach the domestic sphere of camp commanders. As a result, a woman who had lived for years in conditions of material comfort, sustained directly by the labor of concentration, camp, prisoners walked away from the war with no formal accounting whatsoever. She eventually remarried and settled in Stuttgart, West Germany. She died in 1989 while visiting one of her daughters in the United States. Her son, Hans Höss, gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker decades after the war in which he described growing up at Auschwitz as a childhood largely free of awareness about what the camp was for. He acknowledged that as an adult, he understood the full weight of his father's actions, and the interview was notable for its mixture of personal reflection and the limits of what he was willing to say plainly. Her other children largely disappeared from public record. The house in which the Höss family lived at Auschwitz still stands. It is adjacent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, which draws over 2 million visitors a year. For decades, the house was occupied by a Polish family with no connection to the war. In 2021, the museum acquired it with the intention of incorporating it into the memorial site. The proximity of comfortable domestic life to industrial mass death, separated by a fence and a few dozen meters, remains one of the most difficult physical facts of the entire Auschwitz story to fully absorb. Hedwig Höss lived and died in anonymity. But some wives of Nazi leaders didn't just survive quietly. They actively worked to rewrite history and protect what remained of the regime's legacy. None did so more persistently than the wife of Adolf Hitler's deputy. Rudolf Hess held the title of Deputy Führer of the Nazi Party. Formally, he was the third most powerful figure in the Third Reich, behind only Hitler and Goering. He was among Hitler's oldest and most devoted followers, having been present at the failed beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923 and having shared a prison cell with Hitler afterward, during which time he helped transcribe what became Mein Kampf. His wife, Ilsa Hess, had married him in 1927 and was by all accounts a committed National Socialist in her own right, not merely a compliant spouse. She was educated, politically engaged, and fully aware of the ideological framework within which her husband operated. In May 1941, Rudolf Hess made one of the most bizarre individual decisions of the entire war. Without authorization from Hitler, he flew solo to Scotland in an apparent attempt to negotiate a separate peace with Britain. He parachuted from his aircraft over the Scottish countryside, was captured by a local farmer, and was held as a prisoner of war for the remainder of the conflict. Hitler publicly declared him mentally ill, a convenient explanation for an act that was deeply embarrassing to the regime. Hess was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy, and sentenced to life imprisonment at Spandau prison in West Berlin, the same prison that would, over the decades, house several senior Nazi war criminals. As others were released, he remained. By the 1960s, he was the sole prisoner at Spandau, guarded by rotating contingents from the 4 Allied powers at enormous ongoing expense. Ilsa Hess spent those decades campaigning for her husband's release with a dedication that never wavered. She corresponded with politicians, gave interviews, organized petitions, and consistently framed her husband as a man of peace who had been unjustly held. Her campaign made her a cause célèbre among far-right circles in West Germany and internationally, where she was regarded as a symbol of post-war injustice by those who shared her sympathies. The legal and diplomatic situation around Rudolf Hess was genuinely unusual. As the sole remaining prisoner at Spandau from the 1960s onward, his continued imprisonment required all 4 Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, to maintain a joint rotating guard at enormous cost. Western governments periodically raised the question of his release on humanitarian grounds, given his age and declining health. The Soviet Union consistently vetoed any such proposal, a position that the Soviet government maintained without variation until Hess died. Whatever the merits of continued imprisonment, the effect of the Soviet stance was to make Ilsa's campaign for release look more sympathetic to casual observers than a full accounting of Rudolf's wartime role would have supported. Rudolf Hess died in Spandau prison in August 1987 at the age of 93. The official finding was that he had ended his own life using an electrical cord. Given his age and physical condition, that finding was disputed by Ilsa and their son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, who argued for decades that he had been killed to prevent his eventual release, and the revelations they believed he might have made. Independent forensic reviews did not support that conclusion, but the family maintained it regardless. Ilsa Hess survived her husband by 8 years, dying in 1995 at the age of 95. She never altered her public position. In interviews given late in her life, she described Rudolf in terms of personal devotion and continued to present the Nuremberg trials as an act of victor's justice rather than a legitimate legal process. She remains one of the most documented examples of a senior Nazi's wife who lived long enough to become a direct participant in post-war historical revisionism. Ilsa Hess outlived almost everyone from that world and spent her final years actively shaping how her husband would be remembered. But for the wives who chose flight over loyalty, the story took very different turns. Some ending in obscurity, others in unexpected comfort in countries that asked no questions. Not every wife of a senior Nazi official stayed in Europe to face denazification courts and the judgment of their neighbors. Some fled. And the routes they took, the countries that received them, and the lives they built in exile form one of the more uncomfortable chapters in post-war history. The network known informally as the Rat Lines, escape routes that moved wanted Nazis out of Europe, primarily to South America, has been extensively documented by historians. The routes ran through Austria and Italy, often with the assistance of sympathetic figures within Catholic institutions who prioritized anti-communism over accountability for wartime crimes. Argentina under President Juan Perón was the most significant destination, having actively recruited German immigrants, including those with Nazi pasts, in the years immediately after the war. Among the women who made use of these networks or adjacent escape arrangements was Lena Heydrich, the widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, killed in Prague in June 1942 after an attack by Czech resistance fighters trained in Britain. Reinhard Heydrich had been, by most historical assessments, among the most dangerous and capable individuals in the entire Nazi leadership. Lena Heydrich was not charged with any crime after the war, despite her intimate knowledge of her husband's work and her own documented involvement in the social and administrative world of the SS. She was interned briefly and then released. She eventually settled on the island of Fehmarn in northern West Germany, where she lived for the rest of her life. In 1976, she published a memoir that caused significant controversy in West Germany. In it, she portrayed her husband in admiring personal terms, described her wartime experiences with a notable absence of reflection on their context, and approached the subject of Heydrich's role in the Holocaust with a detachment that historians found deeply troubling. She pursued legal action for years to recover a castle in Czechoslovakia that had been used by Heydrich during the occupation, property that had been seized from Jewish owners. Those claims were ultimately unsuccessful. She died in 1985. Another significant case is that of Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and, in the final years of the war, arguably the most powerful gatekeeper in the entire Reich. Martin Bormann disappeared in the chaos of the Berlin collapse in May 1945. For decades, his fate was uncertain, fueling persistent rumors that he had escaped to South America. In 1972, a skeleton was unearthed during construction work in West Berlin, and forensic examination, confirmed by DNA testing in 1998, established that the remains were Bormann's. He had died in Berlin in 1945, almost certainly in the days immediately after Hitler's death. Gerda Bormann had 10 children with Martin and was a committed National Socialist who, in private correspondence that survived the war, expressed views about occupied peoples and racial ideology that were extreme even by the standards of the regime she inhabited. She did not flee. She went to the South Tyrol region of northern Italy after the war, where she lived in difficult conditions and died of cancer in 1946. One of the few senior Nazi wives whose post-war life was genuinely cut short by circumstance rather than justice. Her children were raised partly by relatives and partly in institutional care. Several of them, in later decades, spoke publicly about the experience of growing up as the children of a figure like Martin Bormann. Accounts that range from defensive to genuinely reckoning with what their family had been part of. The wives who fled, or who simply outlived scrutiny in post-war Europe, mostly died without facing any formal accountability. But there is one final category of women whose stories close this chapter. Those who were present at the very top, who knew the most, and who in some cases outlived everyone around them by decades. Eva Braun is, in many respects, the most famous woman connected to the Nazi leadership, and also, in terms of post-war fate, the one whose story ended before the reckoning began. She had been Hitler's companion since the early 1930s, a relationship conducted largely in private and officially denied by the regime throughout the war. She married Hitler on April 29, 1945, in the Berlin bunker, less than 40 hours before both of them were dead. She was 33 years old. Her fate is documented. What is less often examined is the fate of her family. Her sister, Ilsa Braun, survived the war and lived in West Germany until her death in 1979. Her other sister, Gretel Braun, had married SS General Hermann Fegelein, who was shot on Hitler's orders in the final days of the bunker, accused of desertion. Gretel survived, gave birth to a daughter weeks after the war ended, and lived in West Germany until her death in 1987. Neither sister faced any criminal proceedings. Albert Speer was Hitler's personal architect, and from 1942, Reich Minister of Armaments, a position in which he oversaw the use of millions of forced laborers from across occupied Europe. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. He was released in 1966, having cultivated during his imprisonment the public persona of the good Nazi, a man who claimed ignorance of the Holocaust and positioned himself as a technocrat caught up in events beyond his moral comprehension. Historians have spent decades dismantling that self-portrait with considerable success. His wife, Margrethe Speer, raised their 6 children through the post-war years and the 2 decades of her husband's imprisonment. She maintained the family and largely stayed out of public view. When Albert was released from Spandau in 1966, he went on to write a memoir, Inside the Third Reich, that became an international bestseller and made him wealthy. He and Margrethe remained married, though by several accounts the relationship was distant in its later years. He died on September 1st, 1981, in London after suffering a stroke during a visit for a BBC interview. Margrethe outlived him by 6 years, dying in December 1987. What makes the Speer case relevant in this context is what it illustrates about the broader pattern. The wives of senior Nazi officials were, almost without exception, spared the judicial scrutiny that their husbands faced, even in cases where their knowledge of the regime's crimes was substantial, and their material benefit from those crimes was documented. Margrethe Speer lived in homes whose construction and maintenance had been financed by resources extracted from a war economy built on forced labor. That did not become a matter for any court. The question of what these women knew, and when they knew it, was rarely asked formally and almost never answered under oath. Post-war Germany's denazification process was designed primarily to process millions of ordinary participants in the regime, and its capacity to pursue the inner circle of senior Nazi wives was limited both by resources and by political will. The Western Allies were already pivoting toward the Cold War by 1946 and 1947, and the appetite for prolonged and complicated prosecutions was diminishing rapidly. What remained in most cases was a combination of social consequence and private reckoning, or the absence of it. Some of these women expressed remorse in private. Very few did so publicly, and even fewer did so in terms that engaged honestly with the specific nature of what the regime had done and what their proximity to it had meant. The generation of children born to these marriages had a more complicated relationship with their parents' history. Some, like Gudrun Burwitz, doubled down on loyalty. Others went in the opposite direction, most notably Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who was convicted and executed at Nuremberg. Nicholas Frank spent his adult life writing about his father with unsparing condemnation, traveling to schools and universities to speak about the dangers of the ideology his family had served. His approach was the exception, not the rule. The women who built the domestic world of the Nazi leadership, who raised children in houses adjacent to concentration camps, who wore stolen jewelry at state dinners, who wrote letters home from occupied territories, describing the pleasures of requisitioned estates, lived out their lives in a post-war Europe that was, for the most part, more interested in rebuilding than in examining the details of what had been done and by whom. That is not a comfortable fact, but it is the historical record. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.